Welcome to the Just Ingredients podcast. I'm Cara Lynn, and here we talk all things nourishing to the mind, body, and soul. This is a place where you can find just good ingredients to life. The crunchy legal lady, known to her friends as Julie, is a law school graduate and has been a law clerk and legal researcher for one of the most successful law firms in the health freedom space. Before attending law school, Julie worked in the research sphere for 7 years, consulting clients such as Harvard, Yale, and Stanford on how to successfully conduct and fulfill their research. During this time, Julie became disillusioned with the research industry and began questioning the mainstream scientific narrative. After thoroughly researching regulatory agencies and their claims, Julie felt called to help fight for bodily autonomy and medical freedom, which led her to law school and eventually becoming the crunchy legal lady. Welcome back to the show, everyone. Today, I'm really excited for our guest. She is known on Instagram as the crunchy legal lady and talks about things with the law and holistic type of things. And so we've never had someone on the show talking about the law that has to do with all our holistic choices and things like that. And so welcome to the show, Julie.
Thank you so much. I'm excited to be here.
Well, I want to first know how you came up with the crunchy legal lady. Why crunchy?
Yeah, I think, crunchy goes against the grain, right? It's not necessarily smooth. We do things, a little bit differently. When you're holistic, you're not going with the system. You're kind of going against it a little bit. So it's a little bit crunchy.
Oh, I love it. And so were you interested in holistic care and taking care of the body and things like that, plus interested in law, and so you just combine the two?
Yeah, so my story is I grew up in a really medicalized family, normal Western diet, and, grew up taking ibuprofen for everything. That was, my lifestyle, raised by a nurse. Everyone in my family is in the medical field. And when I went to college, I actually fell in love with research. And so I graduated with a degree in communications and research, and then I got scooped up by a giant tech company and asked to be a research consultant. So what I would do is I would consult high-touch clients like Google, Amazon, Harvard, Yale, and help these people actually fulfill their research, help them to know, is it possible? Is this study viable? Is it a good study? And then I would say, okay, is it possible to get the participants for this study? How can we do this study? So that was really my job for a while. And it was during that process that I became a little bit disillusioned with the research industry in general, mostly because, it wasn't just the company I was working for that was trying its best. It's all research in general. But there were a lot of things that I felt we were doing that weren't very ethical and were not what I had learned the scientific method to be. And, the truth is research is very difficult to do. It's really hard. And so money ends up making the difference in those gaps to try to fill those gaps. And I did have clients come to me and say, we want the result of this study to be X.
Wow.
And I would say, no, that's not how it works. But in the end, that is how it works, right? Talking to my manager, other people, no, that's how it works. They're paying for the study. And that's kind of what I found then was there were a whole bunch of problems in research that we could not address that were really difficult, but also, what the client wanted, they got. And so I was helping with these research studies that got published in papers, used for commercials and all different kinds of things. And I just started to, peel back the layers and realize, what I thought was true might not be true. I had a sister who she was already kind of into holistic health. She had learned a lot through her own children's injuries. And, she started throwing some studies my way. Hey, take a look at this. Hey, take a look at that. And I started to do a really big deep dive into our regulatory agencies, their claims, and, what backing do they actually have? Really reading and digging into these studies. And that's ultimately what ended up leading me to holistic health was seeing, the science is there for holistic health. The science is there, and so much of the science is not there for the regular products that we assume that it should be and from our industries. And this really pulled me into the legal field. And so I decided to go to law school, and I was very privileged to work with some of the biggest health freedom lawyers that there are and to learn and study with them. And I realized, there's a gap. There's a knowledge gap for the average person. There are these people who are trying really hard in advocacy groups, who are trying really hard to make, the law work for them and to, help pass new bills and things like that. But there's the average consumer that knows nothing about law and wants to make more holistic choices, but doesn't know how to do that because they don't know how the system works and how law can actually help them. And so I decided to come in and try to bridge that gap.
So interesting. And you talk about these studies being unethical, and I've heard that before. Like, you've got to research who's paying for the study because that's going to show what the result is. But to actually hear from somebody that was in the thick of it and saw it firsthand is just appalling to me. And I can't believe we allow it. But I guess it comes down to the money, right?
The money speaks, but also, the real difficulties. Like most of the research that is being done right now is actually survey research, right? It's research online. That's the biggest, you would think, most of the research is being done in labs, but it's so difficult, right? It requires so much manpower to do that kind of study. So it ends up that the most of the studies that we're doing are survey studies, are interview studies. And when that happens, it's really hard to verify that somebody is human. It's really hard to see that someone is not a robot, because there are robots that will come in and take tons and tons of surveys and participate in studies to get money for those studies. And it's really hard to weed those out. But, there are lots of interests at stake. For me, my big break, the reason I ended up leaving was because I had noticed there was a study that came through. It was a political study that I absolutely knew it was going to bomb. I knew we weren't going to be able to fulfill. But the person who was pushing the study, the salesperson, really wanted it to go through. And later the project manager, came to me to talk about it and said, hey, something's happening with this study. There were no results, and now all of a sudden there's all these results, and they've been manually put in. And so the study had been completely falsified. And so when I confronted management about this and said, hey, we need to do something about this, this is false information, the response I got was kind of, we'll deal with it the way we want to deal with it. And to deal with it, there was really nothing that happened on their end. And so I knew the study was falsified. And so I said, that's it for me. I'm out. So stuff like that does happen.
It does.
And it's tough.
And that's crazy. And good for you for just saying, I'm out. I'm going to go educate a different way. I just got back from Washington, D.C., and you hear about certain stories, but I actually was appalled at some of the stuff that goes on. And we could do a whole episode about that because my eyes were opened. I mean, we had to pay lots of money to meet with senators and congressmen or congress members. And then sometimes we only met with their staff members. And sometimes the staff members would ask who's sponsoring the bill. And if it wasn't a friend of that senator or congress member, they didn't want to hear anything about the bill, even though it had to do with mental health. It's a bipartisan bill. It's for the good of the country, but they didn't want to hear about it if it wasn't sponsored by one of the friends. And so it just really was eye-opening to me. And like I said, we could do a whole show on that. But I did learn that it's like, okay, people just need to educate themselves and protect their own body, their own health, because the government's not going to do it for us. So,
yeah, definitely.
And it goes with your studies that you were just talking about. But that's not why you're on here. I do want to talk about some other things because the other day I was talking about well child visits with my friends, and they were saying like, oh, if people don't take their kids to a well child visit, they could be in trouble with the law. And I was like, what? That's the parents' own choice and own rights. And it made me go down this rabbit hole of legal rights of that the parents have with holistic choices. And so are there certain parental rights or laws that are keeping us from doing or not doing things in the holistic health space?
Yes, under the Constitution, parents do have parental rights over their children. That means rights to direct their education, to take care of their health and welfare, rights to house them, to live with them. And this is something that the Supreme Court has talked directly about. However, these constitutional rights are what are called unenumerated rights, which means that they are not stated directly in the Bill of Rights or the Constitution. They're implied rights under the Ninth Amendment, but also implied in things like the First Amendment and the Third Amendment, things like that. The Fourth, which you wouldn't think that marriage rights had to do with search and seizure, because that's the Fourth Amendment, but they do. They our constitutional rights to marry and have children are connected to the Fourth Amendment. So, these implied rights are really important that we protect, and they are widely acknowledged by courts. They have been for many, many years. There's a number of cases, but two foundational cases for stuff like this happened in 1923 and 1925. And these were both cases about schooling and states trying to come in and say, you have to make your kid go to public school. You have to do that. And, the Supreme Court said unequivocally, no, you can't take these rights from the parent. The parent has the right to direct the life and the education of the child, as well as to look out for their welfare. Now, our states, that's federally, but we also have state powers. And most state constitutions are very similar to our Constitution, to our federal Bill of Rights. And most of them do acknowledge parental rights, but states do have something called police powers. And police powers allow the states to have a little bit more control over their citizens' lives, including having what they would call like mandatory school laws and things like that. However, all of these laws still give the parents the right to educate their child, to give their child the best holistic health or health options available to them. And the big problem that we have run into is a little bit of the integration of federal agencies and state agencies like CPS coming in and taking over some of the role of the parents. And I think what your friends are probably worried about, and what most people are worried about, is that, a doctor or someone will report them to CPS and say, this person's not taking their child to a doctor, therefore they don't care about their health, or this person doesn't want this kind of procedure or, vaccination, whatever it is. And they'll say, they're worried that CPS is going to show up on their doorstep and actually take their child from them. However, there are two streams of thought on this, just to be completely transparent. There are two streams of thought. But the first thing to know is, Child Protective Services and the state cannot take your child away from you unless your child is in immediate danger. Immediate danger. That means that it cannot be future danger. It has to be a present danger, and it has to be an ongoing danger for the child. And so when we're talking about certain procedures or even vaccinations, those are all prophylactic, right? Those are for the future. Those are things that are going to help our kids in the future. And while some people might think that, those things are good to do or to put into their kids' bodies, that doesn't mean that you are a bad parent if you choose not to put those in your kids' bodies or choose not to do those procedures. And so even if CPS does come to your door because of some refusal that you've made or some decision, they can't just take your child away. And most of the time, CPS has way bigger issues to deal with than your kid, right, at that moment and that choice. And so it's usually not going to be a big deal. But parents get, this is where the two trains of thoughts come in. And one is this idea that, well, to show I'm a good parent, I've got to keep a record. And to keep a record, I need to take my kid to well visits. And if I stop taking my kid to well visits, it'll look bad for me later. If something did happen, if CPS came, if it came to a trial, if something like that happened, if I stopped taking them, that could be looked at as bad parenting. In my opinion, that's not necessarily true. It may be looked at as some kind of evidence, but it's not enough evidence alone to say you're a bad parent, because there's always other evidence that you can present that your child is healthy, well, that you've made good choices for your child. The other train of thought, which is more of the train that I'm on, is, when there's no record, like let's say for me, personally, I only take my children to alternative healthcare providers. That's my choice. That's what I do with my kids. And so I don't have a typical medical record for most of my kids. And so, but when there's no record, there's actually no evidence either way when you go to a courtroom, right? It cannot be used against you that you have not taken your child to a clinic. So those are a couple things to think about. But I think if the ultimate fear is CPS and their child getting taken away, then that's something else we should discuss entirely.
That's so good to know, because they were saying, I have to go to well visits to have the record, the evidence to show I've been taking care of my child. If something were to happen to the child, if they got some cancer or some, major thing, I need to have this evidence. So that's really interesting you said that. And so you touched upon vaccines. So I know there's different legal laws in different states, right, about vaccines. And so parents have a choice, but then they sometimes don't have a choice if it's dependent on them going to a public school. I mean, what rights do parents have?
Yeah. So a parent can always choose not to vaccinate if that is the choice they would like to make. However, like you said, if a parent also wants a child to go to public school, then they may have to obtain what's called an exemption for their child to go to school and remain unvaccinated. Some states, there are actually, now I guess there's 4. There's only 4 states that do not have a religious belief exemption, but most do at least have a religious belief exemption and a medical exemption. So under the federal law, under Jacobson v. Massachusetts, every state must, especially if a procedure, a medication, a vaccination is mandatory, they must provide an exemption of some kind, at least a medical exemption, and likely a religious belief exemption as well, which is why now Mississippi is going to be required to allow religious belief exemptions, and hopefully the rest of the 4 states will have to follow suit pretty soon. But other states also include a philosophical belief exemption, which is awesome, right? I think every state should have that. That would be really great. But at the very minimum, you must have states must provide a religious belief exemption as well as a medical exemption. And I know California, everybody thinks about California doesn't have that. They do have a medical exemption still. But what you will have to do is, say, because of my religious beliefs, I am choosing not to vaccinate my child, right? If that's the exemption you want. Or if your child is medically injured by a vaccine, which does happen, then, you'll have to go to a doctor and show, my child is injured. They can't take any more vaccinations. Therefore, I need a medical exemption for vaccination. So you can do that. As far as homeschooling, right? If you choose to homeschool your child, although some states are threatening to try to force homeschoolers to mandate vaccination, I don't think that's going to fly anytime soon. But as long as you homeschool your child, you will not have to choose vaccinations for them. So parents always have a choice. They always have a choice. But depending on what other choices you want to make for your child, and if that choice includes public school, you may have to apply for an exemption or, consider other choices.
Okay, so I'm curious because I follow someone on Instagram who lived in California and said that she didn't want to vaccinate her kids. And so the schools would not allow exemptions. So she ended up just moving to Arizona. So is that not correct?
So California does have a medical exemption still, but it is incredibly difficult to obtain a medical exemption. And they are actively going after doctors who are giving exemptions. And so when she says there's no exemptions, likely what she's talking about is there's no philosophical exemption and no religious belief exemption. And therefore, it probably because she didn't want to vaccinate her child and her child had no injury to it, it was going to be impossible for her to obtain that medical exemption.
Okay, so you touched upon this, that it's really hard to get a medical exemption. They're coming after the practitioners that are giving those. And so why are they coming after those that are giving the medical exemptions?
There is one man in California that is really spearheading this movement, and this is Senator Richard Pan. And he is a medical doctor as well as a senator. He is very backed by many pharmaceutical companies. And, in his estimation, he believes that doctors who are not giving medical exemptions, he does not believe in vaccine injury. So he does not believe that vaccine injury can happen, and he is very against parental choice when it comes to vaccination. And so he's been spearheading many bills in California to, stop practitioners, to go after practitioners who are giving these exemptions, because he believes that most of them are false exemptions and that those practitioners don't actually, are just doing it to appease the parent or because they feel like the child doesn't need to be vaccinated rather than an actual medical need.
Okay.
So I guess that's what I'd say.
Yeah, so interesting. We'll move on from vaccines. I want to talk about home births, though, because I actually did not realize that there were certain laws in different states that pertain to home births. And I actually saw it on social media for the first time a few months ago, and I was like, what? And so talk us through that. Like, what are these laws for home births? What are parents' rights? And do they differ in every state?
Yeah. So this is great. The first thing I really like to talk about, because lots of people love to use the language that, home birth is not allowed in certain states, right? There's laws against it. It's not allowed in certain states. Now, I would like to change that language, because that's not true. It's not that it's not allowed or it's illegal. It's not illegal. It's just not regulated in those states. So when the state decides to regulate birth or home birth, then things like licenses for midwives become available. So midwives can become licensed through the state and through the medical board, right? And then they can practice. And so many people, when they have home births, so I've had 2 home births. I actually, with my daughter, my youngest, I actually had an unassisted birth at home. So I had a free birth with her. And, many people tried to tell me, right, oh, that's illegal. It's not illegal. So that's the first thing everyone needs to know in all 50 states. Having unassisted births is not illegal. But, most people, when they choose to home birth, they want a licensed practitioner, a licensed midwife, a licensed nurse midwife. And when the state doesn't provide that, then midwives can't get a legal license to practice home birth. And so that's why people think it's illegal, because if you want to have a home birth, you'd likely end up having to have either an unassisted birth or choose to have an unlicensed provider and do it under a contract, a personal contract, rather than having a home birth. And people are get really worried in those cases, like, what if something happens to the baby? Will I get in trouble? Things like that. And that's kind of what stops people from having home births. But as far as we don't have any Supreme Court case law about what happens if a baby dies during birth, but all the highest courts in the land have talked about you can't hold mothers responsible for babies passing away during the birth process at home. You just can't, because women, we've heard stories, and most of us know women who have births very spontaneously, right? In taxi cabs, on the street, like in their home, trying to go to the hospital. So this idea that you can hold, a mother accountable for just giving birth naturally, I think knowing who's on the Supreme Court right now would be kind of laughable in that sense. And so I think people get really worried about this. And I understand the worry because people want to protect their children, right? They don't want to have the safest birth possible. And many times people believe that includes having a medical provider with them and having a licensed midwife with them. So to answer your question in general, you always have the choice to birth at home, regardless of whether home birth is regulated by your state, right? It's just, can you get a licensed midwife? That's the question.
That is so good to know, because you do hear that it's illegal or their state won't allow home birth. So really, it's those states that don't.
Yeah, they don't regulate midwives or license.
Oh, license them. That's the word I'm looking for. So in states that don't license midwives, it's not illegal. It's just that you're going to use a contract labor or it's going to be free birth, which we don't really have any laws about.
Correct.
Okay. Mm-hmm. Good to know. That will clear up things, I think, for a few people. Okay, so then let's go back to homeschooling, though, because I know it's a really trendy thing these days. People are really looking into it, wanting to do it. So is it legal in every state, or are there hoops that people have to jump through in different states? What are the laws and rights on that?
Yes, so homeschool is legal in every state. Under those two cases from 1923 and 1925 we talked about before, states cannot stop people from homeschooling their children. However, because they do have police powers, sometimes they can put stipulations on that. So certain states might ask you to give them a curriculum, or, require you to tell them that you're going to homeschool, or keep an attendance sheet. Those are all pretty popular. And but every state must allow homeschool. Okay, that is good to know. All right, I'm going to move on to practitioners. We talked about it just a little bit, but especially after COVID, you heard a lot about practitioners, like, oh, these practitioners can't practice these holistic methods or these alternative methods, or they're regulated by the law. It's illegal. And so here in America, do practitioners have certain laws of things they can't do in the holistic space, or that's just sort of made up on social media? If they're licensed, so if they're a licensed practitioner, then the state may put certain regulations, or the medical board may put certain regulations on that practitioner. So that practitioner may or may not be able to do certain things. So a great example of this was during COVID, ivermectin. Many of the state regulatory boards, there's actually kind of like for lawyers, there's the ABA, there's a special which controls the bar and the bar exam. So for medical practitioners, they have one of those, and that organization, told all the licensing boards, you need to stop all practitioners from using ivermectin. You can't do that. And so many of the medical boards started to go after practitioners, put out the statements and things saying, if you're licensed, you can't use ivermectin because the CDC says so, et cetera. And they put out, they would go after doctors who were doing that. So if a practitioner is licensed, they may be limited. However, there are ways to protect practitioners who are even those who are licensed. But there are also unlicensed practitioners, and there are also naturopathic doctors. Sometimes NDs are not regulated by the state. Many states are not like that. But Utah, where you live, NDs are regulated by the state, and you can get a naturopathic doctorate. And but that would be a whole other board and system. But most of the unlicensed practitioners, it's really a contract between you and the practitioner, right? And once you make that contract, they can treat you the way that you have asked in that contract to be treated. As far as licensed practitioners go, to protect them, they could also use this method, right? They can also have specific contracts with their patients saying, and they can also form something that's called a private membership association, which says, we are both private citizens. We're agreeing to this treatment. I know that, this is outside of the standard of care. I know this is not it's like a waiver, right? Like, I know this is not what you usually do. I know that this is not, how you're supposed to treat, but I am asking for it. I'm agreeing to it, and I'm agreeing to the consequences that might follow. So those are some ways licensed practitioners can get around that. But yes, medical boards can really tie down licensed practitioners.
That is fascinating. And I didn't realize that about private memberships, because so many doctors have been saying that lately. And I know my mom, who I help with her healthcare, her main doctor just said, I'm turning to a private membership. This is how much it costs yearly. And so, for instance, I'll just use your ivermectin example. Could they then prescribe ivermectin to my mom, but not get in trouble because it's a private membership, and so the board couldn't come after them? Is that what you're saying?
Yes, because the idea of a private membership is you're no longer acting in the public sphere. So it's private. It's just between you and that doctor. And under the Constitution, we have rights to contract. And actually, that's an enumerated right. It's one that the Supreme Court and as well as the Constitution actually talks about, is the right to make contracts. So you are making a private contract that has nothing to do with their public sphere of being a doctor. And therefore, other agencies and public entities can't kind of come in to their, the state can't really come into this private agreement because you're deciding we're doing this outside. So another example of this with private memberships is even in dry counties. Let's say in a dry county is one that doesn't have, you can't have alcohol in certain places. Utah has many dry counties, right? In dry counties, if you have a private membership, you can actually still have alcohol and sell alcohol to that private membership because it's not public. It's not for everybody. It's only for those people who are in that private membership. So yeah, a lot of holistic practitioners are starting to use this method because that's what it really should be, right? It's just between you and the doctor, and it's your private contract, and it's a way that they can actually treat their patients in a way that is right with them, right? Is right with their soul and allows them to do what they feel is best for the patient. It's restoring the doctor-patient relationship.
Okay, so in my mom's case, it is just a Western MD, right? Practices Western medicine and is a doctor. So do you think more and more doctors are going to go this route then, so that their license is protected and they can practice how they want?
Oh yeah, definitely. It's becoming quite popular.
So then the medical board that oversees everything is really going to lose their power if people do this.
They may, and I have a feeling there's going to be a little bit of pushback, and maybe a lot of pushback, and we will see what that ends up looking like. But for now, I would say, in America, I will say this, in America, the contract is sacred. Mm-hmm. It's just the truth. It's just the truth about the United States of America. The contract is really sacred. It's what the foundation of our country. And, we came together as states in the beginning, only 9 came together. And it was based upon this contract. The idea was, we're doing this so that we can have commerce together. We can have interstate commerce, and we can help each other. And that's why we're United States, right? And in many ways, the Constitution is just a contract, right? It's a contract that we all abide by. And so contracts are pretty strong. But that doesn't mean they're unbreakable, especially if they're not well written or well, balanced, put into place. So you have to be careful with who you trust to create a private membership association or any of these things. But I do think it's going to be a little bit harder for states to break this than they might think.
So interesting. So I know after COVID, it was in the news that quite a few doctors lost their medical licenses, whether medical exemptions for vaccines like you were talking about, or not giving the COVID vaccine, different things. So had they been in this private membership, that the patient who got the medical exemption for not getting the vaccine, that doctor would have been protected.
Most likely. I can't say 100% of the time because you also don't know. Judges are just people. And so they all have their own biases, influences, and every state law is going to be a little bit different. The common law will be different. But for the most part, they are more likely to be protected and would have been more protected if they were in private contracts or had a private membership association. But many of those doctors are actually getting their licenses restored, like Dr. Peter McCullough is a good example of this. And there will be, I think there is going to be that pushback, and hopefully we will have learned a little bit as these practitioners get their licenses restored. My hope is, and I don't know if this will actually happen, but my hope is that, the medical boards will have learned a little bit of their lesson not to try to take away licenses, especially when we're in the middle of a giant experiment.
Yeah.
But we'll have to see. But yes, theoretically, they would have been protected.
Let's take a quick break to hear from our show sponsor. Switching to a more toxin-free lifestyle is a challenge, and some swaps are harder than others. One of the swaps that has been hard for me is finding a laundry detergent that cleans my clothes and leaves them smelling good. Thanks to my loyal listeners and followers, I learned about Truly Free. Truly Free creates both laundry and home cleaning products for families who want family-safe, non-toxic cleaning solutions that actually work. Truly Free is free from chlorine bleach, phosphates, 4-dioxane, and harmful fragrances. I am getting the results I want without any of the dangerous chemicals. Truly Free offers refillable and reusable packaging, which empowers families to reduce their environmental footprint. Get real cleaning power with absolutely zero scary ingredients. Use code JUSTINGREDIENTS at trulyfreehome.com today. Now back to the show. I want to ask you about naturopaths because you said that some states don't license naturopaths. So does that mean those states just don't have a naturopath program? You can't go see a naturopath doctor?
No, you could still see one, but it would just be private. It'd be unlicensed, right? So many naturopathic doctors are licensed in Arizona, actually. There are lots of other programs around the country, but the one in Arizona is probably the most popular and rigorous. And then they can get that license in another state, or they can go to a school in their state. But their state, that school is not going to be board certified. So it's not going to be licensed. They're not going to get licensed. It's going to be like, anyone can make their own school, right? Like you can make a certification for anything. You can say come, take my certification, come to my school, but it's not going to be recognized by the state or controlled by the state. So, states may have many different naturopathic doctor programs. They're just not going to be recognized as board certified in that state or as licensed in that state. But they can still practice, just like any unlicensed practitioner can practice. But it's going to end up being a private contract situation.
Okay, I did not know this. I thought a naturopathic doctor went to their medical school of naturopathy, you know what I mean, and was board certified. And so if they're not certified, though, does that make someone nervous of did they only go to a year of school? Is this just a 6-month program they went through? Do they even really know what they're talking about? Did they learn? You know what I mean? It makes me a little nervous.
It depends on the program that you went through. Like I talked about, the one in Arizona is incredibly rigorous. It's probably more rigorous than most medical schools that people are asked to attend and that your doctor goes through. But, when you work with someone who is unlicensed, yeah, you are taking the gamble on them, their education, and what they actually know, right? But I would say, and maybe you can say that this holds true, I would say that you might have some knowledge on this being in the holistic space, but in the holistic space, oftentimes if you are, let's say, a fraud or a bad practitioner, or you are loading, vitamins with sawdust or whatever it is, your reputation is everything. And once you get found out, right, once someone says that and you gain a bad reputation, no one's going to start going to you, right?
True.
If you're not legitimate, and this is the way the market works for most things. Most products, if it's a really good product, if it's a scam product, for a while, they might have 5 stars, right? For a little bit, they got all those robots or whoever it was to give them 5 stars, but they're going to drop no matter what because people will buy it and then they'll say, give reviews or whatever it is and say, no, this isn't going to work for me. So I would compare naturopathic doctors or alternative practitioners, even chiropractors. in many cases live in this same kind of world where if they're not legitimate, right, they're going to hang by a string and ultimately get pushed out of the market, most likely.
Yeah, that makes sense. And it comes down to the patient, just like it comes down to the consumer to do their research and understand who they're going to go see, just like they need to understand what product they are buying. But that actually leads me in to want to talk about products, because you're talking about products being a fraud. And now being in the supplement world and making supplements, I am dying at what companies can put in their supplements because there's no regulation, at least that I'm aware of. And so the other day we actually tested a turmeric powder, and we're making an anti-inflammatory supplement. And this turmeric that came in was legit rice powder with maybe 1 or 2% turmeric just sprayed on the rice powder. And I about died because I'm like, you still label it as turmeric. You could put that in a pill, and people are having rice powder rather than their turmeric. And there's no one regulating this, correct?
Well, there is, in some senses, a little bit of regulation. In a general sense, as we think about it, like the FDA or something like that, no, they're not regulated by the FDA. However, they are going to be liable for any false marketing under the FTC, which is our federal agency that their job is to go after people who are falsely marketing, advertising, and doing things that they shouldn't be doing. And, you know, I mean, I have many feelings about the FTC in many ways, but, you know, the FTC does even go after really small people who lie. You know, sometimes they do that. Sometimes they don't go after the right people. But, you know, anyone can say, hey, there's false claims. This is just rice powder. And the FTC will and can go after that person. So in that sense, they're a little bit regulated. And also, like we talked about, it's mostly going to be the market that's regulating them, right? It's mostly going to be, you know, proprietary testing certifications, or, you know, you're really going to have to do your research generally, and it's going to be up to the consumer to be their own regulator.
And so tell people what FTC stands for.
They're the Federal Technology Commission, and their job is they combine with the FDA. There's some overlap between the FDA and the FTC, but the FTC's job is to make sure that false advertising isn't rampant, especially when it comes to food and drug products. So their job is to say, are there false claims? Is this product actually doing what it's doing? They do work a lot off of reports that they get. So any consumer, like if you want to report something you feel is false marketing, and maybe you find out that your turmeric powder is actually rice powder, you can submit a complaint to the FTC, and then they will look at that product for themselves. And now sometimes the FTC is seen in this light that they're going after all the little people for really mundane, small things, like not having the right kind of unsubscribe button or something like that. But sometimes, you know, the FTC is going after the right people. But if more people knew about this resource that we could report people to the FTC, I think for the false advertising and marketing, I think a lot more products would be more well regulated, and maybe the right kind of products would be looked at by the FTC.
Yeah, interesting.
Does that make sense?
And interesting. And like I said, being in the supplement world, the FTC is very good about making sure you say the right things on your labeling. I feel like you can't claim like, oh, this is going to cure cancer, or this is going to cure your heart disease. You know, you can't say stuff like that. And they are very strict about that. But when it comes to the actual powders and ingredients and things in products, that's where I don't think they're checking very often. I mean, you hear about like, for instance, there was the CBD study, and they went and tested, you know, 20, I can't remember, it's like 20 different CBDs at a show. It was some natural show, and only 3 of them came back with the actual amounts of CBD that were listed on the label. And so some had far, far less amounts of CBD. And so I feel like they're good at what we can write on the label and can't write. But when it comes to the actual ingredients in the product, I don't know if there's many checking that.
Yeah, it's true. Also, sorry, I was mixing them up with the FCC, but they're the Federal Trade Commission.
Okay.
That's what it stands for.
Okay.
The Federal Trade Commission. Sorry.
That's what I thought. But yeah, I'm glad you said that. Okay, so let's actually talk about the FDA and the EPA, because you do hear about them in a lot of things when we're talking about products. And so maybe just tell people the difference between them.
The FDA is the Food and Drug Administration, so it's particularly focused on our food and more so things like, vaccines, biologics, blood work, and the drugs and manufacturers of drugs and things like that. So the FDA is really focused on food and drug, but the EPA is about our environment, right? It's the Environmental Protection Agency. And their job is to make sure that, well, hopefully their job is to make sure that our environment is protected, and that mostly that these companies or states or other people aren't overly polluting our environment.
Okay, so you hear all the time people frustrated with both these agencies, because you'll hear like in the EU, there's so many more restrictions on food products and, artificial dyes. And in the beauty industry, they ban so many more chemicals than they do here in America. And so thoughts on that? Like, why isn't our FDA or EPA more involved in these things?
My thought on this is we have let our agencies, our federal agencies, now be run by the manufacturers they're supposed to regulate. So we call this, in the law, federal capture, agency capture. And in my opinion, many of the agencies that we work with have been captured by the industries that they're meant to be regulating and meant to be holding their feet to the fire, really. And because of that, a lot of people don't understand even how the regulatory scheme works and how these products are regulated. But even in our scheme, I think a lot of people would be shocked to know that on some years, 75% of the FDA's budget comes from the manufacturers that they're supposed to be regulating.
So like the big food manufacturers?
Big food, big pharma. I would say probably predominantly big pharma. I mean, maybe it's 50-50, but big pharma makes a little bit more money than big food, and so they contribute a little bit more to the FDA. But yeah, well, that's who's paying.
So their job is to protect us, but yet people have lost their trust in those two agencies because of knowing this, that they're just being paid by the big guys, and so therefore they're not protecting us with ingredients or with certain laws or banning things or making things healthier for us. I mean, there's this mistrust out there. Can we trust them? That's a hard question.
Yeah, it's a hard question. It's multifaceted and layered. I would be careful. I as a rule of thumb, I would say, I only trust God and the people that I intimately know for long periods of time. And these are not people that I personally know for a long series of time, right? And I would just say, be careful, because they are in many ways beholden to the industries that they are supposed to be regulating. Now, I do have friends, I have heard from people who are regulated that they felt like, the FDA was not their friend per se, or like we didn't have this really big friendly relationship. However, in my own experience, I go to many of these meetings, right? I go to VRBAC meetings, I go to CDC and ACIP meetings all the time. And I would say, the manufacturer is given quite a lot of say and sway, especially in the data that they're able to present to the committees. And they are well treated by the FDA, and not in a sense that like they're always lavishly collaborating, but most people don't understand that, it's the manufacturers who are doing these studies, right? It is not the FDA who's doing the study. It is the manufacturer who is doing the study. The FDA is allowed to peek in, right? They'll say, send us some interim data. Let's see your study, right? Send us on this product, right? Whatever the product is, let's say it's a drug, send us some intern data about this drug. How's it looking? But the manufacturer is ultimately the one in control of the data, right? They are the one in control of the data, and they are the one who ultimately will end up presenting the data to committees later. So, in a usual and regular meeting, most meetings last for one day. They're usually like an 8-hour meeting. Although when it comes to ACIP, sometimes they have a 3-day meeting about all these different vaccines, depending on how big the product is. But typically, these are 8-hour meetings. And what happens is, a group of committee members is selected. Now, there are people on the committee that stay on the committee full time until they decide to leave. But there's also people who are elected to be on the committee and are chosen kind of at random each time to switch up the committee. These committee members are not necessarily working for the FDA. That's why they say they're like an independent committee. They usually are tied to universities and oftentimes are university professors. And they are given this data, when the company, let's say a company is like, hey, FDA, we want to make this product. All right. The FDA is like, all right, if you want us to approve it, give us this much money. They're like, great, here's this money. All right, let's look at the study. Send us some intern data. Once the intern data comes back good enough and the manufacturer says we're ready for approval, then they'll say, all right, we're going to get our committee together and, we'll have this meeting on this date. And so then they have the meeting, and about 48 hours before, maybe sometimes less, committee members are given a packet of information about the product and about the studies that have happened. Sometimes it's less than 48 hours, but this packet is actually also available to everyone, the whole public. You can get all these packets. In fact, you can get a transcript of every one of these meetings. You can go to any one of these meetings that you would like. It's actually really easy to attend, and you can make public comment at any of these meetings. But these committee members, they're not always intimately involved in these studies. They're not. And oftentimes they're just reviewing this huge packet of information. I've read many of them, and they are dense, right? They are difficult and tough to get through lots of times, easy to miss stuff. And then on that day, they have a bunch of presentations from the manufacturer. They will have a couple presentations from the FDA who will say, after we went through the data, these are things that we saw that we think maybe the manufacturer is smoothing over. But the manufacturer in many ways has the last word before the committee goes to deliberate and decide what they want to do. And all their deliberations are taped. So they're all on Zoom the whole time. So you can listen to their reasoning, what they're talking about. And after that, the committee votes. I mean, in the interim, there is public comment, halfway through. There's a public comment section. And there are comments that are submitted. I don't know if the committee actually ever gets to see all the comments that are submitted, but supposedly the FDA sees all of them. But only a few people, probably 5 or 6 people, get to have a 3 to 5 minute presentation. That's it from the public. And then the committee meets together and they, have their little chat about it, and then they vote. And after they vote, they give any last comments, and it's a done deal. So that's kind of how it works. But I don't think a lot of people are aware of, how much, because I have heard manufacturers literally say, in this meeting, I'm sitting in this meeting, I could not believe this is happening in my ears. This was actually about a vaccine that they would like to give to pregnant women. And the study that had been done showed some pretty bad indicators that this could possibly cause up to a 20% rise in preterm birth.
Wow.
It's a big deal.
Yeah.
It's a big deal. And big rises in miscarriage. Now, because of the data, because they didn't have as much, we can't say for sure how much of a rise in preterm birth this vaccine may cause or may be a factor in. However, there's the potential for 20%, right? And another thing that was presented, right, mostly by the public, not by the FDA or by the manufacturer, was that GSK also tried to make this same vaccine. And they stopped trying to make this same vaccine because they had the same results of preterm birth and stillbirth in their study, over 20%. So the products are very similar, almost identical. And, the committee is sitting there and they're discussing, and I can tell that Dr. Sally is in charge of this particular committee. I can tell she's frustrated and, that she doesn't like this. She's an OBGYN. She's quite concerned about this preterm birth rate. But the manufacturer hops on and gives this little speech about how dare you take away this product that'll save so many lives. Don't you dare stand in the way of this product that's going to save so many lives because you're concerned about a coincidence.
Wow.
So these are some of the, these are sometimes the statement, right? The pressure that a lot of these committee members are under in some ways is unfathomable. And I don't think people think about that these committee members, they have ties to the FDA, and many of them will then end up working very closely with these manufacturers, right? If not getting a seat on the board later. And so there's a lot of pressure for them to say yes in many, many ways. And, in this case, this was the first vaccine I had seen that actually got 4 no votes, even though it was a committee of 14, so 10 yes votes, it still passed. But, this is, all the people who voted no felt like they really had to justify themselves. They were so afraid. They were so afraid that they had said no. So these are things we don't often think about, but this is what's happening. And this is part of the manufacturer's sway. So yes, we should be really careful in trusting our regulatory agencies. I'm not saying everyone there is bad or everybody there is in cahoots. That's not it at all. But on a general scale, there's a lot of money and a lot of people, and there's a lot of pressure. And when those combine, it can be really difficult to get a good, safe product.
Wow. You know what? Listening to this, the only thought that comes to my mind is the consumers have to do their own research. They have to just be educated and empower themselves with their own knowledge, and then make their own choice dependent on what they have learned and researched themselves. Thank you so much for sharing all of that. We could talk about that for hours. One thing I do want to say about these regulatory committees, or not committees, but agencies like the FDA, EPA, I do have a love-hate relationship with them. There's things that I wish they would do better, like ban some ingredients and look at the health of the body when doing things. But there are times that I know, as making my own products, that they are involved in. For instance, some of the certifications are really hard to get. We have the gluten-free certification, and it is very, very strict. And I mean, the things that they make us do before we bag a product, I mean, we're cleaning the air vents, we're cleaning the floor, the ceiling, we're cleaning every little aspect of the room. And you can only have X amount of gluten, show up on your test as you swab. So it takes hours and hours to get the room gluten-free certified. So there are things like that. And I even know with organic, getting that organic certification label, it's some hard paperwork and strict standards. And so there are things that they are doing correct. We just need them to do correct on all the other things as well.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, and I'm not saying you should completely boycott everything and that everything the FDA does is bad per se, but like you said, it's a teeter-totter. It's a love-hate relationship, and the consumer really just has to do their own part and say, okay, even if it's got this FDA approval or this label, does not necessarily mean it's safe for me and my unique circumstance, because we're all very individual.
Yes, I agree 100%. Like I said, I could ask you so many more questions. We have hit our time, and we might just have to do a part 2, because there's so many other laws and things that I want to ask you about. And I know these followers now are probably so intrigued by all of this. But as we wrap up here, this might have been a little overwhelming or discouraging to people. And so what's your advice that you would give these listeners after listening to this show?
I would say there are so many resources out there that can help you. And, there are things just right at your fingertips now that can really help you navigate the law, navigate these issues. And there are good people like Carlin who are producing awesome products and it's not as difficult as you think to do the research on these things. And even if you just try, things will get better. If each of us just did one tiny thing, right? Like one tiny thing a day, things will definitely get better. And of course, always check in with source, always check in with God, with your intuition, with yourself, and you won't be able to go wrong.
I love that. Everyone who's listening, if you want to learn more, go give her a follow on Instagram. It's the Crunchy Legal Lady, and you will learn about all different topics. I've seen you do things from, like you said, home births to homeschooling to vaccines to agencies to all the things we've talked about and more today. Is that the only place people can find you, or where else can they find you?
Yeah, so my website is crunchylegallady.com. And on that website, I have a bunch of freebies for people, free guides about writing exemptions, free guides about keeping your bodily autonomy. And I do have some what is it called? Courses. I have some courses and other webinars and things coming out to really help people get a hold of their own sovereignty. So please follow me on, find me at crunchylegallady.com.
I love it. Thank you so much for being here on the show. And like I said, followers, go give her a follow. And I always end my podcast episodes by asking my guests what they have found to be the best ingredient in life. What would you say it is?
Well, I would actually say it's alchemy. It's the ability of all things to come together for your good and to transform, what may seem negative into a positive in a very beautiful way.
Oh my goodness. That just gave me chills. No one has ever given that as their answer. And I love that it all can come together in a beautiful way. Take your negative things in life, your hard things in life, your trials, and turn them into something positive. I love that. If we all did that, could you imagine how beautiful this world would be?
And everyone has the ability to alchemize their life. Everyone has the ability to turn the negative into the positive.
Ooh, I love that. Yes, they do. Thank you for ending our show with that thought. I am going to actually go ponder on that some more. So thank you again for taking the time to be here. And I know the listeners learned a lot, and I appreciate you being here.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you so much for listening. Remember to subscribe to the Just Ingredients podcast to learn more about your health and good ingredients to life. Plus, get daily tips at just.ingredients on Instagram.